you looking for clever methods to address complex problems? Do you need ways to make predictions, determine probability, or minimize risks? If you do, then you're in the right place. Welcome to our podcast that we call Smart Remarks, Howarth States. Now here are your hosts, Christian Smart and Doug Howarth.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are in the world. Welcome to Smart Remarks, Howarth States. I'm Doug Howarth. With me today is Dr. Christian Smart, my co-host. And
hello.
Dr. Amrit. Help me out here, Amrit.
Yep, I'm Dr. Amritpal Singh Agar.
Let me get a little read here on Dr. Amritpal Singh Agar's bio here, and then I'll go into Christian and into me. So Amritpal is currently the cost and estimating manager for the Canal and River Trust. I'm excited to talk about that. They are the custodians of 2,000 miles of English and Welsh inland waterways, which were a key driver in the Industrial Revolution. He's also the host of the podcast, The Cost of Everything. He holds a doctorate in cost modeling, which he received from Loughborough University, and holds a master's in nuclear engineering from the University of Birmingham. He's worked for more than 10 years in nuclear and water industries. He's a keen runner and hopes to run a few marathons after the lockdown. He loves watching and playing soccer and cricket, following the Liverpool Football Club and the West Indies cricket team, respectively. My co-host, Dr. Christian Smart, is the chief data scientist with Galarath Federal. He supports NASA and the DoD in a variety of analytics for cutting-edge programs, including nuclear propulsion and hypersonic weapon systems. Previously, he was the cost director for the Missile Defense Agency, the MDA, for several years, where he led a team of over 100 estimators. He's written extensively about cost modeling, parametric cost modeling, risk analysis, and has won numerous best papers at cost estimating conferences. His book, published by McGraw-Hill, entitled Solving for Project Risk Management, Understanding the Critical Role of Uncertainty in Project Management, hits bookstores November 3rd. Christian has a BS and BA degrees in math and econ from Jacksonville State and a PhD in applied mathematics from the University of Alabama in Huntsville. He, his wife, and his young son reside in Nashville, Tennessee. And me, I'm your host. I'm Doug Howarth. I founded and run my own company, which we call Me Inc., M-E-E Inc., and we named it after multidimensional economics, or me with one E, the new field that I discover. And in that field, what we do is we compare cost, value, and demand across 4 or more dimensions. So along with 2 others in my company, I was awarded U.S. patent 10,402,838 for multivariable regression analysis. It's the world's first software designed to break markets into 4 dimensions. And so we work for NASA, Lockheed, United Technologies, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon. So I've gone to many of the same conferences that Christian attends, not nearly as prolific in winning titles there, but I've gotten a couple of awards there too. And me, I enjoy running, lifting weights, and travel. I live in Southern California with my wife, and I have a bachelor's degree in economics from Washington State University. So with that, gentlemen, again, thank you for coming both today to our podcast. I'm very excited to introduce our guest. Amrit, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your upcoming thoughts about the Merseyside Derby? Because I know that Liverpool won the title last year in almost record fashion. And I looked at the table and just discovered that they're actually behind Everton. And so this is a very important game coming up. So maybe you could talk about that.
Very important game. Gosh, where do you start with the Merseyside Derby? It's actually quite a friendly derby compared with a lot of them. I think Liverpool and Manchester United have the real kind of rivalry up there, like a lot of anger around that rivalry. Mm-hmm. But Everton haven't actually beaten Liverpool in the league, I think, for 10 years. Mm-hmm. So it's been very one-sided. But this season, Everton, so they got a new manager last year, very internationally renowned manager, Carlo Ancelotti, who's an Italian legend. And he has brought them to the top of the league. And Liverpool actually had a very shock result last week. They lost 7-2 to Aston Villa, who have only just come up in the league.
Right.
And it was a massive shock. Liverpool don't get beaten, and they all of a sudden got absolutely trashed by someone who would generally be considered a lower team, a team that's potentially going to be relegated. So
Right.
I know Americans don't really do the whole relegation promotion thing.
No. But for those who don't, I'm familiar with it. Why don't you describe relegation for our listeners that may not know about it?
So the Football League, it actually consists of a tiered system. So you have the Premier League, which is the top 20 teams in England. And then you have another league, which is the Championship below that, which is another 20 teams, I think, or 24. And then there's another league and another league below that and another league. And then you go to the non-league and there's hundreds of teams in the non-league and they play regionally. But you can theoretically get promoted all the way up. So what happens is you play each team twice in a year. And then the bottom 3 teams in that league by points, you accumulate points throughout the year. They get relegated down to the league below. And the 3 teams below who finish in the top get promoted to the top league above. Wow. And there's a massive, there's quite a huge, apparently a power grab at the moment where the top 6 teams are saying, let's reduce the league to 18. It's very, very influenced by money. The Premier League is the most lucrative league in the world. Right. Very, very rich league. And I'd say it's probably nothing in comparison to the NFL. Just the sheer value of every team in the NFL. Is it 36 teams in the NFL or 32?
32, I think.
32.
Yeah. And the kind of contracts there for media rights and everything, I think it pales in comparison. But yeah, this is it's a very strange time. I think everything's been really influenced by COVID and not having teams in the stadium. Yes. Because there's just a blanket ban in the UK at the moment. No fans allowed in the stadiums. And you really sense that influence because it was almost like Liverpool had an extra player. Right. So they'd play Barcelona and they had this extra player behind them and they would win out of nowhere against teams that they shouldn't win against. And there's an end of the Liverpool ground called the Cop. And that's where it's basically like it is the extra player and no opposition likes to go to Liverpool. It's like a fortress. Right. Yeah. And it's just amazing. I think this year is going to be totally strange. But then I think it's quite unpredictable anyway. The league, right? It's not like most leagues. You know who's going to win, or pretty much the top 2 teams. But in England, I mean, 5 years, I think it was about 4 years ago, and I happened to be in New York on my honeymoon 4 years ago when Leicester won the league.
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yes,
and they were 5,000 to 1 at the start of the season. Wow. Someone put a bet on them, and now the bookies don't put 5,000 to 1 on any team anymore. So yeah, but I think it's going to be a very close game. But I'm Liverpool are bringing a few players back who had been put in isolation because they had COVID. So and they're their main, one's their main goal scorer and one's their new creative playmaker. So it's I think Liverpool still have it just over Everton. Okay. I don't think Everton are going to break their duck.
I find it fascinating. You were working as a nuclear engineer, then you moved over to the Canals. I know that's from my reading on it and actually being on some canals. There's a massive amount of technology that's in canals that people had to invent as they went along. And I know some of the canals in Western England, in Eastern Wales, are on aqueducts. And so you've got to get the water up very, very high. You've got to keep the canals flowing. And now with COVID, I don't know if you have restrictions on how many boats you can run on the canal, but tell us a little bit about what it is, what your job is like day to day and what you do. And first of all, tell us how you came to it too, by the way. How did you manage to decide to do that after maybe building a nuclear reactor and going to a 5 knot/mile/hour boat and making sure it can go through a lock.
Yeah, like, as you can imagine, a totally different pace of life, really, isn't it?
Right, yes.
I mean, like you mentioned at the start, my background is nuclear. I finished my master's in nuclear engineering and then went into industry straight away. So I spent 3 months working at Sellafield, which is where the original sort of weapons development program was in the UK, which was developed quite rapidly. And I was working in radiometrics, so very, very nuclear, very much nuclear science and engineering. Then I was doing a graduate program. I spent 2 years working in nuclear power plants in maintenance on a graduate program, going to loads of different sites and experiencing very strange situations, having to learn a million different alarms in your induction, and people saying, if this alarm goes, even though everyone says hold the handrail when you're supposed to walk down the stairs, it's like, if this alarm goes, run. So, so yeah, I'm not gonna argue with the safety guy when he says that. So after that, I spent time in decommissioning. I spent time, doing project management type stuff, and then there was an opportunity to work on small modular reactors and to do my doctorate at the same time. And I felt like that was a good challenge. It was a sideways step into cost estimating, which you kind of interact with it, interface with it when you're in engineering and when you're in project management, but you're not directly involved in it. And then you're in it and you realize that, okay, this is actually quite a big challenge. And I spent 4 years doing my doctorate alongside working, developing the small modular reactor. Had fantastic opportunities to contribute at major international conferences, and also I did some consultancy work for the International Atomic Energy Agency. So managed to get myself over to Vienna a few times, which is an amazing city. I love Vienna. I think if at some point I go back into nuclear, it would be good to go and work at the IAEA in Vienna at some point. So, but yeah, fantastic place. And, all kind of, everything was pointing towards, okay, long career in nuclear. I think one major shift was, I'd say, I like to go running a lot. And when I was going out running, I would run down the canals.
Yes.
And it just so happened that after I sat my viva, so I had my examination for my doctorate, there were still questions about what my future contract might look like at the company I was working in. And, I was still umming and ahhing. And then I just so happened to be running at the canals to think about it. And I saw a sign for the Canal River Trust. Never seen that before in my life. I've lived around canals my whole life. I'm from a place that's just outside of Birmingham called Smethwick, which was the heart of Industrial Revolution. It's where sort of Thomas Telford and all the engineers there. I live probably about 5 minutes away from where the original steam engines were built.
Wow.
In the Soho factory and around there. So a lot of growing up, first school trip was down to the canals. So I've had a long-standing relationship with them, but I had never seen the Canal River Trust logo before. I thought I'd go and check it out at home, and it was really odd. I just so happened to scroll over the vacancies thing, not thinking I would actually go work for the Canal River Trust. And the top thing on there was cost and estimating manager. And I had a look through the spec and I was like, I've done all that. So it's a really strange situation. So it was all within the space of a week. They offered me an interview. I had an interview at a consultancy, and I also had an interview within Rolls-Royce where I was working, just to discuss my future. And it was one day after the other, and the middle day was the Canal River Trust. I got a call back from the Canal River Trust the next day, just on my way into work, to discuss my future at Rolls-Royce. and sort of what they were offering was amazing. And I think part of the interview process, I had to kind of discuss what it was, why I wanted to work for the trust, and I went back and investigated everything about what they did, what the challenges were. And really, the challenges aren't that dissimilar to nuclear or any other industry. But what I found was there was an extra dimension to it, the socio-environmental aspect of what the canals are trying to be. So in the past, it was about the Industrial Revolution, and actually they were outdated before they were even completed. They were, a lot of them were dug out by hand by Irish laborers and others, and it took a long time, and by the time they were going through it, the railways had been developed, and they started steaming through, and there were a lot of land purchases by railway companies who then converted semi-complete canals into railways. So I learned a lot about the history of them in that process of preparing, and then really just understanding about the Canal and River Trust is a charity now. So there was a period of time where the canals were developed. There was a period of time before World War II where they were just abandoned. There was nothing happening with them. A lot of them had basically just had growth occurred, so there was no water in them anymore. It was just all gone. And then sort of 1940s to 1950s, there's a little bit of a renaissance where you had hobbyists, boaters who wanted to regrow it and turn it into something again. And it's actually the hobbyists who actually started to dig them back up and sort of reclaim them. And then beyond that point, sort of 1950s, the British Waterways Board was formed. And the British Waterways Board, I think it was a government organization. It operated until sort of 2012, I think, 2013. And it was, because it was government funded, it would go up and down in funding. It was never about let's bring them up to a modern standard. It was let's keep them ticking over. Let's make sure the reservoirs are okay. Everything is up to scratch, but let's not spend too much on them. And it was a very traditional, old school, quite organization. Like most government organizations, very much hierarchical, very structured, very rigid. And then the current government, who've been in power for a while now, they basically created this Quango, which is the Canal River Trust, and it became a charity. And that charity now has the remit of making the waterways accessible to as many people as possible, as a source of health and well-being, and as a way of getting back to nature. And I think the amazing thing about it is, since lockdown, I joined the trust a few years back, and no one had heard of the Canal and River Trust out of anyone that I talked to and I knew. Since then, I've been involved with quite a few charities in my spare time to encourage communities that are underrepresented, that these sort of blue-green ribbons go through these inner city communities, and they don't really know about it. I think, some of the statistics might be wrong on this, but I think 60% of people in England live within a mile of the inland waterways.
Wow.
So it's accessible to a lot of people. It goes through London, Birmingham, Leeds, Manchester, Bath, every major city in England. And then you have old heritage sites that people don't really know about, like the Pontyskillet Aqueduct, which is in Wales, which is this huge aqueduct. It's amazing, and it's a World Heritage Site, and it just looks incredible. So
I think my parents have a picture of themselves floating on one of the longboats over that aqueduct.
Absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
It looks terrifying. Absolutely terrifying.
180 feet over the ground or something crazy like that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And that you think of the engineering that's gone into build these things. And I think for me, so my role is, within cost and estimating, is on the asset maintenance side of things and asset improvement. So we have 70 plus reservoirs. We have, like I mentioned, thousands of miles of of canals and the associated towpaths and bridges. So there's a lot to manage. A relatively small team when you consider it as a national infrastructure, and some very individual challenges as well, where things weren't made to any kind of standard. There's no engineering drawings for a lot of these things. Engineering drawings didn't even come about till 150 years after these had started being built. Massive challenges in terms of what's been put in and around the canals since. So, optical fiber, various utilities, they've all been planted into underneath the beds of these and into the towpaths. And, sometimes we wonder what's actually under there. And there's a potential risk that we're going to actually hit something a lot of the time,
let me just stop you for a second here, Amber, because I know what a towpath is, because I've run on canals before. But people may not understand how far back the canals go and what a towpath means and why we needed to have one, and what changed it and how the technology changed over time. Maybe you could explain that to our listeners here.
Yeah. So this is before the engine, basically. So these things were before the engine even existed.
Wow.
So the waterways were seen as a way of getting things from one part of the country to another. So materials and goods and getting pottery and things out of Stoke up to Liverpool and then across on boats to America and things like that. So the water was a way of transporting, but you needed something to be able to pull it along or push it along, and they used horses. So horses were actually used to tow these boats. So they were called towpaths that went alongside the canals, because horses were literally towing the boats, and there is some very, very clever engineering that went around it. So the towpaths were designed to be able to hold horses. But
if you hit a tunnel, because I know you had to make a few tunnels there, then you had to go from a towpath to a different technique. Why don't you explain what that might be?
Yeah, and I don't know if you have the saying in America called legging it.
We do, but it means something different than it means in England. So why don't you describe what legging it means in England? Because I know, but I'm not sure all of our listeners might know what that means.
Well, in relation to the canals, I think
right.
I could talk for ages about different English phrases that we have that might be slightly different. But when you were actually in the tunnels, there are obviously no towpaths either side. So what they would do, and it was dark as well, it was probably pitch black, unless you paid for an oil lamp or you had something like that. And some of these tunnels do go on for miles. And this is something I did when I was on my first school trip, actually. What you would end up doing is lying down on your back on the side and literally putting your legs against the wall and walking along the wall and bringing the boat with you. So that was called legging it. So you literally do that. And that's quite an experience in the dark as well.
Yeah, so I thought that you are lying on your back and pushing on the ceiling, but it's the sidewalls that you were
hitting. A lot of these things are, I'd say, in the past slightly, but we have boaters who go on boating cruises or permanently reside on the canals. We've got people who walk their dog, people who run, people in inner cities. So we go through the docks in London, and we've got massive stretches of canals in London. The Regent's Canal is a lovely part of London. And you just think how close this is to the financial district, to the very business hubs in London. And there are people there who don't exercise as much as they can, don't relax as much as they can. And just those few moments of relief that you can get on your lunch break, walking down the canals, middle of sunshine. There's an area there called Little Venice, and it's very idyllic in the middle of London. And what we're trying to promote is that sense of well-being that you can get by being near water, and that's a very crucial part. And I think something that it would be really interesting to discuss, which is how do you value that? I mean, we don't make a profit, we don't sell things, we don't sell the product. The product that we're selling is the experience of being on the waterways. And when we're making our decisions as to you have various options when you can maintain something. Do we do a patchwork repair on it? Do we do an extensive repair on it? Do we replace it? And all these things require an investment and a decision to be made on that investment. And actually, how do you then value what that's going to be? Because if someone did a what the value proposition was of the canals 250 years ago,
Mhm.
it's nowhere near what they would propose for what it is now, because we're not transporting goods anymore.
Well, you are transporting people. I imagine you could work out some sort of thoroughfare charge that you would have. I mean, I remember it was going down the Danube and the Rhine, and if you go to several parts of both rivers, and then of course but not the canal that connects them both, the Main-Rhine Canal, the fiefdoms and the kings and queens and princes that used to populate those parts of Germany and Austria used to put chains across the river and stop the boats, as I'm sure you're aware. And so they would charge people a toll. So I think there is a historic precedent for the charges that have been levied on the river. Right now, you don't levy charges on the users of the river?
Yeah, so there's boating licenses. So boaters do have to get licenses. Unless you're a sort of pleasure cruiser and you hire a boat, then I think it's incorporated into the hire charge from
Right.
whoever the vendor is. But really it's more what are it's sort of social cost benefit. So
Sure. Right.
so by us improving a certain section of the canal, what benefit does that provide? So for example, with COVID, we noticed a lot more people using the towpaths or the walkways because they were close to where they lived and they could access them without, getting into any issues of not being in isolation and sticking to within a certain distance of their homes, which is what it was like in the earlier part of the lockdown. And there's been a lot more discussion about, okay, we want to open these towpaths and convert them into some more cycle lanes. So a lot of the towpaths have been over the past 10, 15 years turned into cycleways because they do, you can get from one town to another town via the slow ways without ever coming up to the roads. And it's a lot safer. Shouldn't be quicker because you shouldn't be riding them there very quickly because you've got towpath users as well. But so there's a benefit there to society. There's a benefit there to the economy of people's health, but also being accessible places that people can get from A to B in a slightly different way. But we have a certain limit that we can spend in any 1 year, really, on as part of our budget, our expenditure budget. And we do have very big projects sometimes, but we tend to have hundreds of smaller projects. And it's almost like the impact of one or two projects going over budget or over schedule can have a knock-on impact on 3 or 4 projects. And if you magnify that impact, then there has to be some almost tough decisions made as to which projects are allowed and which projects shouldn't be.
Well, I'm sure Christian would have something to say with respect to portfolio effects on that, right, Christian?
Yeah, so it's one of the things, and something you have a chance to do in your job, Amrit, is do portfolio uncertainty analysis and see what the overall risk analysis, because most organizations do not do that. So many organizations do not do quantitative risk analysis at all, but even those that do, they typically will do it for a single project at a time. So you have a risk for this project, risk for that project. You understand how that works, but you won't understand the overall interactions and what the overall organization risk is. And without really understanding that, you're subject to portfolio level problems, which you won't have reserves at the portfolio level. That will, and I guess it's like you're seeing this where you'll hit funding constraints, which leads to schedule slips, which leads to cost growth, and that it has a whole domino effect. And so be careful about that. So that's one thing to talk about is the need for that portfolio level analysis. There's 2 things that projects often do is they say, well, if we fund everything to a 50% confidence level, 50th percentile median, then at the overall level, we'll have some diversification benefits, just like when you buy stocks. But unless you actually do the analysis, you can't make sure that's really the case, because it's not like stocks. There is no, like with stocks, and if you're not making a leverage investment, there is a limited downside. You can lose what you invest, but there is an unlimited upside. Imagine buying Apple stock 20 years ago and how much money you'd have if you bought a lot of Apple stock 20 years ago. It's like your 5,000 to 1 bet on Lester. So you don't get the diversification benefits because you have a limited upside. In many cases, like with Canal and River Trust, you have a very valuable benefit, but it's somewhat qualitative and it's hard to put a value on it, and that's relatively fixed. But the cost and schedule growth can be very bad on the downside. So limited upside and very bad downside. So diversification you have to be very careful about. The other issue is when you start new projects and organization, you have to be careful and look at the longer term impacts across the portfolio. Building up sand charts and looking how things work. Many organizations, and I've seen this happen in my work, they'll say, okay, well, we made this year, let's give this project a little seed money to get it started. But that's like conceiving a child, but then not having the funds to raise it. Right? So conceiving a child's cheap, raising a child is expensive. So,
another thing you might
do some upfront planning, and a little bit of planning goes a long way in terms of saving money. Yes, Doug?
I was going to say another thing you might consider, Amrit, is that it's very likely the case that that you've got a demand curve for your funds. Like we've seen demand curves form in every mature market. So this is the Dow 30 that's the top 30 stocks here in the United States from the 20th of June of this year. These little dots here, each one of these dots represents one of the stocks. So the horizontal axis is their volume, and the vertical axis is the price. And what you see happening where that black line is that what we call a demand frontier forms in every mature market. So if you look at this kind of arrangement, say in fighter, bomber, and attack aircraft, which Christian and I have studied very deeply, it works out that the demand frontier for fighter, bomber, and attack aircraft is very highly correlated and is very stable. Over 20 years, the slope has changed less than 2.5%, and the intercept's changed by 1%. And so what happens, demand changes every time somebody puts a new plane into the inventory, the demand has changed. But at the limit, the thing hasn't changed very much. So what you can do, what we've done for other industries, is you actually plot this in a year-over-year fashion to see if your frontier is stable or if it's moving. Is it contracting, stable, or is it expanding? It works out that then you can also plot the demand for something like that against the value. And I'll while you guys are talking, I'll assemble this so we can look at a 4-dimensional system that might be of interest to you.
What are the dots on the demand frontier? What are those, like 3 dots on the frontier? What are those companies?
At this time, it was Boeing, Apple, and Microsoft were on the frontier.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Those all make sense. So Amrit, so your background in nuclear is very interesting to me. There are some cross connections in the cost estimating profession. Basically the top DoD senior executive in the cost estimating profession has a PhD in nuclear engineering.
Right.
If you're aware of that. Dr. Rick Burke, he is the Office of the Secretary of Defense for cost assessment and program evaluation, and he's the head of the cost assessment side. So,
wow,
I thought that's an interesting connection. Do you have any experience with doing probabilistic risk assessments as part of your nuclear work?
Yes, I did. Well, I did it for 2 different things really. One was in I started to do a bit of probabilistic risk assessment on the cost of or the schedule, the impact on schedule from changing from a traditional stick-built nuclear power plant to a modular nuclear power plant, and understanding what the key drivers were. The big challenge there was having enough detail on understanding the dependencies between each stage and the interfaces when it came to the modules. So you would need to have a certain level of definition to understand where those interfaces would need to be. But it has been used quite extensively, actually, I think, in schedule, understanding the schedule cost of nuclear power plants traditionally as well.
Okay.
I think one of the problems you got is with correlation effects
Yes.
in understanding, those dependencies. If you just stick on the technical construction side of that, then you're going to be completely missing out on the what would be traditionally considered as external dependencies, which are supply chain effects and your sort of unknown unknowns, if you can account for weather events and things like that as well.
Right.
I don't think anyone can predict. Well, can you predict having an incompetent supplier?
Well, my argument would be that Norm Augustine, in Augustine's laws, he said that you can't really predict specific unknown unknowns, but in the aggregate, you can predict them just like we do mortality statistics for actuarial tables. So you can kind of see how they, what the overall likelihood of them occurring is. So you can calibrate to the historical cost and schedule growth history, and that would kind of tell you how many unknown unknowns would you expect to happen given what's happened in the past.
I think that's half the battle, is being able to understand what wasn't knowable at the time, and being able to categorize those. So within the trust, and I think this goes back to that portfolio level analysis of the program and understanding what are the likely causes of cost and schedule growth within those. It's in which dimension are you looking at that? Because if you look at it from a programmatic perspective, you can look at schedule and look at what caused the variances in your schedule at a project level, and then at asset level, because we've got various different asset categories. And then you can have a look overall at the program. What was the driver of schedule growth? Was there one key event that happened in the business year? Now, if there are events that happen consistently, so for example, with climate change happening, we're seeing much more severe weather events in certain parts of the country.
Yes.
And that means, okay, consistently, we know we're getting this. Now it's become a known unknown, I guess you would say, but whereabouts that would have an impact. So you have the weather event, but it might not necessarily cause any adverse damage. If it does cause adverse damage, that can be a significant proportion of emergency funding required to deal with that immediate problem. Because one of the KPIs that we would be measured against is keeping the canals open, and obviously a canal being knocked over, or even a tree being knocked over on the line can have that effect. So we need to immediate response. So understanding the cost impact and the impact of the weather on a specific area is a major challenge. Now, being able to model that and predict that in the future is equally a challenge. So it almost then becomes a question of, okay, we know we've got this dependency. We know we've got, okay, a weather event happens. We've got a probability or a likelihood of an event causing a certain amount of damage. Right. How do you maintain that as a predictable variable? How much of that do you account for? Okay, we're going to have a contingency fund that allows for that, versus, okay, we want certainty in our program. Therefore, we're going to account for, okay, there were 3 events. This is the severity of the event in terms of expenditure. We had to provide for emergency repairs and things like that. Therefore, we would predict 3 of these events a year. Right. And then you would almost have that contingency against that. So if you look at it purely from one dimension like that, it could be accounted for. But then if you account for that, that means there's 2 or 3 other projects that you're not going to be doing, because you're predicting that the unknown event is likely to happen. Now, that if you don't want to hamstring yourself, that's probably what you have to do. And there's only so many projects you can actually carry out in a year, isn't there? So, yeah, I think that's something that I've been toying with, but how to formalize that, and not just make it about, it's categorizing them and characterizing the various risks as well. I think there's a very interesting bit of work to be done there, in terms of, climate change is going to have a massive impact for us.
Yes. Weather impacts are difficult, because to some extent, you're trying to use the past. As Shakespeare said in The Tempest, what's past is prologue. But in weather, in the current situation, is somewhat unprecedented, right? There's really, what's past is not exactly prologue, because climate change and rising sea levels and weather is getting more extreme. That's difficult to that's difficult to use the past to predict the future. There's some people that work in the catastrophic risk insurance industry that have done modeling like that. And the weather is subject to extreme risk, so you'll have some relatively mild events, and you'll have some really, really bad event in the United States. Be a hurricane, and so there's something called extreme value theory that you can take a look at to kind of see how to model those extremes, and how to look at what is the probability of a really extreme weather event in England. I don't know. I guess the United Kingdom, and are you subject to hurricanes, or what are the really extreme weather events that you have in the UK? Flooding?
They would be so mild compared to what's experienced in sort of mainland America and on the coast. And we don't have anything. I think it's just being from an island, we just complain about the weather every day, so it just becomes such a big thing. But I think flooding is the most. We have had actually noticeably over the summer some quite severe storms that affect the whole country, really, but they're not so severe that they've caused massive amounts of damage this year. But it has been noticeable that in the last 10 years, and again, this is a very small sample, isn't it? And it's subjective when you don't take it into the context of hundreds of years of experience. But we've got much milder winters, much more severe storms, especially in the summer, and some extreme downpours at very specific parts of the year that the traditional infrastructure is not designed to hold. So you got the Environment Agency building flood defenses everywhere. People are suffering with when there are a lot more uninsurable areas, and you get doomsday sort of I guess people doomsday saying that the new coastline is going to be along the south of Birmingham at some point. So buy up housing in Birmingham. And Birmingham's in the Midlands, so it's in the middle of the country. But I guess it's the same thing that they say with LA and things like that, isn't it? But we're obviously on a much smaller scale. But the cost of these events happening more frequently is something that there probably isn't the funding for, and it's the resilience factor, isn't it? It's how do you make infrastructure in the future to be more resilient, and that's something that we're competing with at the moment as well. So
sure, and the challenge is, if you say you try to plan for some relatively extreme events, they're going to be probably less likely you're going to be several years in a row where you have more funding, and so management will be getting somewhat antsy and say, well, we could have started 3 or 4 more projects by now, but then the 5th year comes and you wind up needing it. So that's the tricky part, right? So
yeah, you got to keep your stakeholders happy, and while also having a level of conservatism in your it's that old adage of it's better to have more money than less, isn't it, when you're planning for these projects. But I'd say for us, the single biggest risk in the past was that our infrastructure was under was under maintained for such a long period of time that it's it's almost like they uncovered the very, again, hyperbole, but it's almost like they uncovered the pyramids and then started to use them again.
Yeah.
But they just weren't they weren't fit for purpose, and they were being repurposed.
Sure.
But now we're coming to stages. It's a lot more funding's going into making these things more resilient. So increase the asset condition greater than where it would have been in the past, such that it can cope with it's a longer life cycle for these assets than they would have previously been developed for. So it's a totally different challenge to nuclear, to be honest. Or having said that, there have been certain concepts that have been trying to look at how we promote those concepts from nuclear, and how we would maintain a nuclear power plant to how we would maintain a canal. And then some of these, I think they're very sort of known concepts within aero, defense, and nuclear, but less so in other infrastructure. And I think it is that whole safety, value, and maintaining the output of what they need to deliver. But then again, you can't spend millions of pounds on planning, which is what we could do in nuclear, especially because of the value of producing electricity, or, like we've discussed before, the value of making sure that defense is available when it needs to be available. So best laid plans and everything, and we just I think what's interesting is how the cost of planning might drop significantly in the future, because of using various sources of data that are much more accessible now, and better processing power, and being able to use that and utilize that in the future.
Yes, that can definitely help. Yes, automation can definitely help with that.
I think that will definitely help us, because the manpower to do that, to do the way I used to do it when I was at nuclear power plant. When you're planning for an outage, a lot of money goes into planning for the outage, and then you spend a hell of a lot of money to make sure that those what you have planned in those few weeks where the plant is shut down and you're losing £1 million a day from not having generated electricity, you make sure that work's done. Whereas I think it's probably cultural as well. When you're on sort of non-critical infrastructure, it's not as go almost. It's not as making sure you're on the ball, and if it doesn't happen on one day, then it'll happen on another day, and that's how slips happen in schedule, isn't it? So,
well, my apologies. I tried to assemble this model, and there were some pieces that were missing, so I couldn't show you the 4D model in its physical state. But basically, what we've discovered here, Amrit, is that every element in demand has a matching value in a matching point in what we call value space. So, for example, with electric cars, there's a certain amount of horsepower and range that these cars have. And if you take the combination of horsepower and range, in 2013, there's a surface that describes the value of the car based on the horsepower and range. At the same time, that there was that point over here on the demand plane that's describing its demand. In other words, a certain quantity and price that the thing will absorb at that point in time. And so the demand plane the demand frontier is limiting how much is being spent at a certain point in time. And the value plane is reflecting how people are paying for it. So what's interesting in a canal such as your own is, I imagine the canal at certain points, because I know when you pull into towns and pubs and things like that, the width of the canal increases, right?
Yeah, you do have. Well, you've got specific areas where it does increase in width. Yeah.
So there's going to be a certain value to the canal going a certain distance with the normal width, and then there's going to be a different value when the value of the width of the canal doubles or more. That's something you could characterize. You can actually see
Potentially.
how you spent for it and how you could value something like that. If you were to charge tourists, say on their trip, you could maybe charge more money, say going through an area in which they had extra access to the ultra wide places.
See, and I think it is sort of where it crosses into. So these elements of econometrics do cross over into marketing as well. So there's an element of
Yes.
willingness to pay. So you might not necessarily. So for us, there's no ambition really to charge people for using
Right.
these, because they are public rights of way in essence. For us, they are people, and this hasn't always been the case. You go back 20, 30 years, and there were big bars saying do not enter private land. And that's all been removed, and it's been opened up. And I think, like you say, there's very valuable public moorings that are available where where
Right.
boaters can have permanent moorings as well. And there's permanent moorings in the center of Oxford. So we've got the Oxford Canal, which is one of the oldest canals in England, and that goes within a 2-minute walk of the Oxford's business school, and within where all the spires are, and all
Wow.
the Radcliffe Observatory and everything. So there's very valuable moorings there, and in the center of London, center of Birmingham, like I've said before. And boaters have paid a level of premium for that, and I think that the challenge is really not necessarily on charging people so that we break even or anything like that, but actually
Right.
understanding what is the value in us to society. What is the value to society in us doing this work? So what's the business case in us doing this work? And the British government's tried things like, there's something called the Green Book, the government Green Book of Appraisal, and there's a very solid number of, this is your solid number financial business case, and then there's a fuzzy number on the side which is qualitative, which is this is number of trees saved, or whatever it is.
Right.
I've forgotten what it is actually now, but I know that the Environment Agency, for example, are now putting a lot of effort into a cost and carbon estimating approach. So, as well as when they're doing the maintenance works, they're planning for, as part of the decision-making criteria, it's not just on estimating the cost of the job, but
Right.
also within that criteria, which of them is has the most embodied carbon for the decisions that they're making. So I think within the decision criteria, I think in terms of the vertical axis that you had in terms of price, it's almost how interchangeable do you think that is with value? So we've got demand, which can potentially be driven by value as well. So
Sure.
and again, when we come to electric cars in the UK, there's of course the discussion of how far can you get on one charge.
Right.
Probably a lot further than you can in LA, but the other side of it is, what actual value are you bringing? Cleaner air, question marks around the embodied carbon of an electric vehicle, or its actual environmental impact because of mining of rare earth metals and the reusability of these batteries and everything. So there's still a bit of a question mark on all that, but the actual willingness to pay for that value is probably increasing at a greater rate than the willingness to pay for more luxury in a traditional SUV in certain parts of the UK at the very least. So there's almost that dimension that I'm trying to look at of how do we bring that into the canals, the way we value certain canals, and because there is a value to those assets. When they're not assets that we're going to sell, but there's a value in maintaining those assets for a specific condition, to enable people to fish, for example. There's people who if we don't have a certain area of the network available, they can't fish anymore.
Right.
And that becomes a real issue. I mean, there's some wonderful projects and some wonderful stories that I've not really been able to talk about, but there are occasions where I don't know. Have you heard of a program called Peaky Blinders?
Yes, I'm not familiar with what it is. I've just heard there's actually a film entitled Peaky Blinders, right?
Yeah, well, there's a TV series which is it's basically set in Birmingham, pre post World War One. It's quite an interesting take on things. But there's what's interesting about the canals is there are some oddities on the canal. So one of the things is people aren't allowed to do magnetic fishing in the canals, and that's because on several occasions now, people have found unexploded World War II devices. So it's like, okay,
Yes.
you don't want to take your child, magnetic fishing on the canals because you might find an unexploded World War II device. And some people have actually taken those devices with them, and luckily it hasn't exploded. And then they contacted the police because someone else had said that might be a bomb. You better watch out. But and then there's loads of things that we do that have a value. So, for example, the River Severn, which was famous in the past for having a particular fish called shad. And this was fish that was sung about by Henry VIII. It was a great delicacy in England. It was shipped around all over Europe because it was a famous fish. The River Severn was then weired. There were weirs built all over the River Severn, and that meant that these fish could no longer migrate up and lay their eggs, which meant that the shad had disappeared from England by the 18th century. And now there's an EU part-funded Canal River Trust River Severn project to build fish passes along the sides to allow these fish to migrate up there for the first time in hundreds of years. So we're going to get shad there again. And in the past there were whole communities that were built around fishing that and selling that all over the country. How do we put a value on that being brought back? The investment case for that project was historically linked, but it has a natural angle to it as well. There's an element of nature in there as well, and the value that has. So, for me, it's no longer, when I was in nuclear, it was about what's the levelized cost of electricity, and how does that compare with the cost of a wind turbine or a traditional coal-fired power plant, and what elements of those drive the cost of a nuclear power plant? Well, it's all in the upfront construction cost. Well, what variables drive the upfront construction cost? Well, it's all the various interlinking of activities that have to happen, the very large components that have to be produced, that only one or two suppliers in the world can do these large forgings. And then you're on a very tight time scale between when you get planning permission, when your design's approved, and when you start putting that capital in. And once you put that capital in, you better get that power generation started as soon as possible, because you're paying money on top of that,
right?
All the financing costs. So if that's what's driving it, well, let's make that a lot more simple. Let's make that smaller. Let's do them in make it an option of you finance the first one once you've done the small one. Once you've done the first one, small modular reactor is up and running, you're starting to make money back, revenue back. So then you can decide whether you're going to build the second one there, and you have a much simpler and smaller financing associated with nuclear power plants. When you make them small modular, you lose the economies of scale, but you probably get economies of multiple. So there's that's a very traditional metric, and a much more straightforward way of valuing a project, compared with we have the option to rebuild the Pontyskillet Aqueduct in another part of the country. What value will that bring for us?
Well, I think in the United States, we've had programs where we have paid for cleaner air, we've paid for improving fisheries, and here in California, where I live, and most of the West, it's, in fact, where Christian lives, he's part of the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the whole place has been pushed up by dams. And so there are quite a few dams in the United States that have done the same kind of ecological harm that you're talking about. But there have been moves afoot to change that, where governments are spending money to move dams or to build ladders around dams or to basically take the dam out and let the river flow. And I imagine we could quantify that by figuring out, well, how much did we spend to get these kind of fish back to a population? And you could probably work out the fish, and you could probably work out the quantity, you could probably work out the number of miles or square miles that were involved in a project like that. And I think you could probably wrestle with that. But to the whole point about how you would figure that out is you have a whole bunch of data that you're going to have to collect over a variety of projects. I mean, that is it's a very interesting problem, but it's also it's got so many facets to it,
Yeah.
Yes.
It's which elements do you collect and everything? I mean,
right.
I guess, the value of a canal in the inner waterways in England are totally different to, the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal. It's not,
Right.
they're not the same. But, I know that New York, the New York canals are there's heavy investments in those canals to regenerate and re-stimulate or stimulate the towns that run alongside those
Right.
canals.
Yeah, that is a resurgence, and so you could point towards that.
Yeah,
That would be something. And as it applies to fisheries, I mean, there are several projects in Washington State, Oregon, and California in which people have entertained or are actually making it easier for fish to go further upstream. So here in the U.S. West, they've made Lewiston, Idaho is actually a seaport, and the way they've done that is they've put a series of locks, like they have in the canal system. They put a series of locks to get the Snake River connected to the Columbia River to let the Lewiston is it's several hundred miles inland in a very arid part of the world.
Right.
And so in order to get the fish there, you'd have to put some steps around that. Now, I don't know what they've done specifically for Lewiston to make that, to reinvigorate the fish there, but there's several places along the West Coast here in the United States where they're entertaining ideas like that. And I don't know how many have actually been, engaged. Maybe Christian, I know the TVA's done a massive restructuring of most of where you live and hundreds of miles in every direction. Do you know anything like that that Amrit might be able to look at and use?
That's a good question. So it goes through most of Tennessee and northern Alabama. The Tennessee River kind of cuts down through North Alabama, and Alabama is the state in the United States for biodiversity. I think it was, when I was young, I would fish dams. It's a good place to catch fish, but I'm not aware of any any particular fish that were disrupted in the same way that the shad were due to dams. There's quite a few fish, and they seem like whatever body of water you put them in, they seem to do pretty well. And there's so many different species of all sorts of animals in Alabama that and some of which don't really live anywhere else. That I think if you lost one or two due to that, it just probably wouldn't be noticed. There are just so many.
I think that's
like frogs with chameleon type properties and things like that. Things that you don't really hear about.
There's been, I had a marine biologist on one of my earlier episodes on my podcast, and one of the things that I've never heard about when we've talked about biodiversity loss, but there have been some species of fish, for example, that have thrived due to the impact, at least in the short to medium term, of the change. It's almost like a change in the balance of power. So they've actually thrived in those conditions. So I guess you can. It's difficult to measure when you've only got that one point to kind of say, okay, that's what had an impact, and not being able to understand what are the knock-on impacts if you change it again.
So like in Alabama, I mean, people are not environmentally sensitive, so typically not as much as they are, say, in California. So people don't hear about it as much. People don't notice the big thing people in Alabama do is they are buying up wilderness areas so that they can preserve them. But
Right.
that's one thing you hear about in Alabama.
Well, here in the American West, there have been several attempts to revitalize the salmon populations. And then the salmon populations were historically part of the Native American diets. And so there's been the famous Judge Bolt ruling that actually made it so that the non-native people had certain blocks of time that they could fish the salmon so that they wouldn't overfish them. And then there's also problems about, because of the dams, how far upriver the salmon can manage to make it anymore. So I'll do some digging. I'm pretty sure I can find some information for you about what we've spent in the United States for trying to save the salmon and maybe a few other species. It's a big thing out here in the West because we are more environmentally sensitive out here. And also back to another point that kind of is a little tangent to what you're talking about, but not much, is we spend a great deal of money here in California, much to the chagrin of the automakers, by making our environmental standards quite a bit higher than they are in any other place in the country. So if you come to the U.S. and you buy a car, there's a California standard and there's the standard for the rest of the country. And what that had the effect of doing is that pollution on balance, the particles per million that you could measure of the various noxious gases and particles in the air is fallen quite a bit over the years. And so you could actually figure out the investment people have made, governments have made, and the industry had to make to actually sell in California to affect the cleanliness. And part of what you're offering with the canals, I mean, I've been on a canal before too, and it's a fabulous place to run on, is you're paying for the aesthetics of the thing. Now here in California, by the way, we have a canal that the story here in Southern California is that Southern California is a desert. The average rainfall here is 15 inches where I'm sitting. And if you go out just another 20 miles to the north, the average rainfall is 6 inches.
Right.
It's unheard of to get all of your rain total in 2 days here.
Yep.
And so to circumvent that, what we did here in California is we had Mulholland. I don't know if you've heard of him, but Mulholland went up basically along with the powers that be, and we basically tapped into Mono Lake up in the north, and we basically have a pipe that runs from Mono Lake down to Southern California. And so we have this canal that's not nearly as pretty as yours, because your canals are often in the countryside, or even when they're in the city, they're surrounded by green. They have a canal that's running through the desert. It kind of looks like a little miniature version of the Suez Canal.
Right.
And these little tiny...
Is this the one that's been covered with, or the lake's been covered with black balls, floating balls?
Those waters empty into that lake.
Yep.
And that lake is 10 miles from me, right over that way.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, exactly right.
Right.
In fact,
I mean,
right below the Hollywood sign, there's Lake Hollywood, and that's another one of the lakes that's filled up from this reservoir. So those pipes, that canal system.
In Alabama, what I remember about waterways is there is a waterway that stretches all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And there was a lot of rivers in Alabama, but none of them fed directly all the way from the north all the way into the Gulf of Mexico until they did some excavation to build the waterway and connect it. And that was completed in 1984. The railroads didn't like it because it competed with them. They initially had predicted a lot of demand at that time, but it was supposed to compete with the Mississippi to some extent. It is used to take launch vehicles that are built in Decatur, Alabama, to Cape Canaveral. So it is big enough to carry like large launch vehicles, Atlas V, Delta IVs. It was originally projected to carry, maybe 10-25% of the Mississippi, but it carries only like 2% of the Mississippi's cargo capacity. So it they way underpredicted the amount of demand for what it would be using, but it was considered at the time, it's considered a big pork barrel project. Nixon was trying to, back in the day in the early 70s, was trying to win southern states. And so he committed a lot of money to the project so people would vote for him.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really fascinating...
$2 billion project.
Wow.
Wow. When you look
Yeah.
through, I've looked through some of the archives that we have at the trust, and you come across some amazing stuff. And there are these compulsory land purchase signed into legislation. So you've got this old style, 18th century legislation papers that talk about compulsory purchase in this area, and it's hand signed and all this kind of stuff. And it just you just think about how different the times were then, where it's just, well, we're just gonna carve this into the ground and fill it with water, and then get from A to B, and that will be how everything goes for the next however many years, because we're at the forefront of engineering.
Right.
And then within a few years, it's like, well, we've got this massive steam engine. Why don't we just use this and put rail track down everywhere? I mean, there's some fascinatingly weird innovations that were developed where, sort of, I guess, a last story, but we've got this one thing in the northwest of England called the Anderton boat lift.
Yes, I've seen
And
that.
it's an incredible piece of engineering for the time, but essentially it is a giant bathtub that lowers you down to the river level, because the canal that was coming up from Stoke basically ended up at a different level to the river below. And they were saying, shall we have a series of locks? No, it's going to be too expensive. How do we get down there? It's going to be too sharp an angle. Well, let's just get a boat in this bathtub and lower it down to this level. And it's just when you and it only goes, I think, 2 miles an hour, I think, maximum. I don't think it's very fast. But at the time, it was considered like a roller coaster. So people would go on it and just like almost like they're surfing, and just like scary times when you're in the 19th century and you're going at 2 miles an hour on a lift. So.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing technology. It had a bunch of counterweights to let it work to work that way, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's all changed now. It's all modern control systems, PLC systems. So
Right.
yeah, it's all
Wow,
electrically
that's neat.
driven now. So yeah, you can still go on it. So if you're ever in the country, that would be one of the ones that I would recommend you go on.
Well, I'd like to see that, because and they also have some of the parts that are still there from the original mechanism, right? They have a little.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the one interesting thing with a lot of this. There's a lot of original features all over the place, and you see, if you go into Manchester and you see them, dewater a section of the canal, you can still see the original stonemason markings on them, which basically mark out, this is how much work I've done. This is how many bricks you have to pay me for. So it's 200 years old.
Why don't you describe the Anderson boat lift a little bit more in more detail for the people that aren't as familiar with it as you are?
Well, we've got the there's some really good videos on the Canal and River Trust YouTube channel as well. So we've got one on the Anderton boat lift, and so there was a lot of demand in America for pottery from England, and because of that demand, the potteries are actually located in Stoke, which is near the West Midlands, so in the centre of the country. So you'd need to get them to a port. To get to a port, you'd need to try and get there mostly by horse and carriage. And you can imagine traveling by horse and carriage with a load of pottery. It's not going to end up in the best condition by the time you get to the port. So one of the drivers for building the canal was from Stoke up to the northwest of England, to the ports, famous ports around Liverpool. Were to transport pottery. Now, because of the way the land contours and everything, canals evolved over time, but originally they tried to contour them around the land and everything, so that they didn't have to do any action. And by the time they got up to the river, it connects the River Weaver, which the River Weaver then goes out to sea. And the canal was at a higher level, and the river's below. And because of the gradient and the cost of bringing in locks, it it was the Weaver Company, actually. It's a very, very famous company in the northwest of England, who basically sponsored the boat lift. And essentially what you have is, I mean, you got a picture over your shoulder there, Doug.
Yeah.
And that just reminded me of the Anderton boat lift, because it's essentially almost like this big scaffolding almost. So big scaffolding, black Victorian paint. And what would happen is at the top level, you would have a boat, two boats probably, that could go in side by side. So we have they're very narrow boats. They go in side by side, but at the same time, underneath at the bottom level, you would need two boats to come in at the bottom level as well. And then what would happen is the water, I think there was some, it was controlled by the water levels basically within the, some kind of casing. They would have water levels, and on the one side they would lower the water level, and on the other side they would increase the water level, and by gravitational force they would basically switch the two. And at some point you would meet the other one, but you couldn't see them because the sides came up quite high. But it would literally just be by sort of a natural. It was just a natural lift, and very basic principle. Very, very basic principle that the ancient Greeks knew about. But a very innovative solution to a difficult problem of gradient, and how much more of the land do you want to carve out? How much more do you want to spend on that? So it was quite ingenious.
It is, yeah. And for the listeners and viewers right now, can you give us your website so that we can find out more about it?
So you can search for the Canal and River Trust on YouTube, and we've got some really good, interesting videos on there on some of our challenges and what we've been doing. You can also do walkthroughs on there of the actual canal. So there's some quite nice virtual tours on there. And you can go to the website, which is the canalrivertrust.org.uk. And then also I'm going to plug my podcast as well, which is the Cost of Podcasts, the cost of everything. You can find me in Cost of Podcast on Twitter, and I had Christian on the show a few weeks back. It was a great guest, and then I'll get Doug on.
Well done, well done podcast. Yeah, we have Doug on. Doug has some unique and interesting perspectives as well. So
yeah, I do want to hear more about this sort of 4D. I relate it to econometrics quite a lot, so apologies if that's
no, it's
correct.
It's more of econometrics, but we start with 4D, and then we go to 5 for when we add time, and then eventually 7, 10, whatever we need. So I'll show you some stuff on it. We'll communicate. I'll pass you my email through the LinkedIn.
Brilliant. Yeah, fascinating.
Amrit, it's great to have you on and learn more about what you do. So you heard about what I did and now before, and now it's great to have you on our podcast and hear about what you do. So thank you.
No, I really enjoyed it.
All right, everybody. Remember, Christian's book's coming out on November. Tell him, Christian, November when?
November 3rd through Amazon. If you can't wait till then, Barnes & Noble says they'll have it October 23rd. So go ahead and pre-order today. Avoid the rush on Election Day. That's the official release date. But this is an author copy that I'm holding up. I get a few dozen of these ahead of time. So
excellent, Christian. Well, Amrit, Christian, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching, and that's our show.
Smart Remarks, Howard States has been brought to you by Multidimensional Economic Evaluators. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at info@meevaluators.com. For more information on Christian, please visit his website, christianbsmart.com. And for more information on Doug, see his LinkedIn page, Douglas Howarth, or his website, doughowarth.com. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep reaching for the right answers.